The small-town courthouse in rural Georgia was buzzing with its usual mix of energy and boredom. It was one of those places where nothing much happened, yet everyone showed up anyway, out of curiosity, duty, or just to pass the time. The air smelled faintly of old wood and polished floors, a scent that had lingered there for decades. People sat on creaky benches, chatting softly or flipping through worn magazines. Lawyers shuffled papers, their shoes clicking against the tiled floor, as they moved between offices and courtrooms. Carl the bailiff stood by the entrance, keeping an eye on things like he always did. He wasn't a bad guy, not really, but years of working in this sleepy town had made him jaded. To him, most folks coming into the courthouse were troublemakers, liars, or freeloaders looking for handouts. His job was simple: keep order, show authority, and make sure no one caused problems. Over time, he'd developed a habit of treating people with thinly veiled contempt, especially if they didn't look important enough to be there. On this particular afternoon, Carl noticed someone sitting quietly on one of the benches near the back of the room. She was a black woman, probably in her early 30s, dressed simply in jeans and a plain blouse. Her hair was pulled back neatly, and she held a stack of papers in her hands. She wasn't talking to anyone. Instead, she seemed focused on whatever she was reading. Something about her caught Carl's attention, not because she looked out of place exactly, but because she didn't fit his idea of what a typical visitor should look like. He frowned slightly and walked over to her. As he approached, he crossed his arms over his chest, making himself appear bigger and more intimidating. When he spoke, his voice carried a tone of irritation mixed with sarcasm. "You lost, ma'am?" he asked, his words dripping with insincerity. Maya Johnson glanced up at him, surprised by the question. She hadn't expected anyone to address her so directly, or so rudely before the proceedings even began. Still, she forced herself to remain calm. "No, sir," she replied politely. "I'm here for the hearing." Carl raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. "The hearing? You sure about that? Looks like you're dressed for a day at the park, not a courtroom." He let out a short laugh, glancing around as if seeking approval from the other people nearby. A few heads turned, but most ignored him, used to his brash behavior. Maya felt her cheeks grow warm, but she didn't let it show. She knew how to handle situations like this. She'd faced worse during her time in the military. "Yes, sir," she said firmly, meeting his gaze without flinching. "I'm here for the hearing. I'll be ready when my name is called." Carl snorted, unimpressed by her composure. "Well, don't say I didn't warn you. This ain't no playground. People come in here thinking they can waltz around and waste everyone's time, but Judge Parker doesn't put up with nonsense." He paused, studying her face for a reaction. "Hope you've got your ducks in a row, sweetheart." Sweetheart. The word grated on Maya, though she managed to keep her expression neutral. She nodded once, choosing not to engage further. Arguing with Carl wouldn't do any good. It would only escalate the situation, and she had better things to focus on. Instead, she returned her attention to the papers in her lap, pretending to review them while silently counting down the minutes until the session began. As Carl walked away, smirking to himself, Maya allowed herself a brief moment of frustration. This wasn't the first time she'd encountered someone like him, someone who judged her based on appearances rather than actions. Growing up, she'd learned to navigate such biases, using them as fuel to prove doubters wrong. After joining the military, she'd risen through the ranks despite facing skepticism from colleagues who thought a black woman couldn't handle the pressure. And now, after returning home and earning her law degree, she was about to step into a role few would have predicted for her. But none of that mattered right now. All that mattered was staying composed and doing her job. Today wasn't about proving anything to Carl or anyone else. It was about justice, for the people whose cases would be heard, for the community she served, and for herself. Unbeknownst to Carl, Maya wasn't just another civilian waiting for her turn in court. In fact, she was the reason the courtroom was filling up. Earlier that week, she'd received official confirmation of her appointment as a judge, a position she'd worked tirelessly to achieve. For days, she'd prepared meticulously, reviewing case files and familiarizing herself with the local legal system. This was her first day presiding over hearings, and she intended to make it count. When the clerk finally called everyone to order, Maya stood up and slipped on her judicial robe, which she'd brought along in a garment bag. As she adjusted the collar and smoothed out the fabric, she took a deep breath, centering herself. Then, with quiet confidence, she stepped through the door leading to the judge's bench. Back in the main area, Carl was busy ushering people to their seats and ensuring everything was in place for the session. He didn't notice Maya enter until she appeared behind the bench, her presence commanding immediate respect. Gasps rippled through the room as people realized who she was. Some exchanged shocked whispers, while others stared openly, unable to believe what they were seeing. Carl froze mid-step, his jaw dropping as recognition dawned on him. The woman he'd mocked earlier, the one he'd dismissed as unimportant, was now standing above him, wearing the robe of authority. His face turned bright red, embarrassment washing over him like a tidal wave. For a moment he forgot how to move, rooted to the spot by sheer mortification. Maya, meanwhile, remained unfazed. She greeted the courtroom with a calm, steady voice, introducing herself as the presiding judge for the day. Her tone left no room for doubt about her competence or authority. Once formalities were out of the way, she signaled for the first case to begin, acting as though nothing unusual had occurred. For Carl, however, the ordeal was far from over. As the hearing progressed, his mind raced with thoughts of how badly he'd misjudged the situation and the person sitting before him. Every glance he stole at Maya reminded him of his earlier behavior, making him squirm uncomfortably. He tried to focus on his duties, but his hands trembled slightly as he handed documents to lawyers and directed witnesses to the stand. By the time the lunch break arrived, Carl could barely think straight. He excused himself to the hallway, leaning against the wall as he replayed the morning's events in his head. How could he have been so blind, so arrogant? He knew he needed to fix this somehow. But how? Little did he know, Maya wasn't done with him yet. Though she hadn't addressed his earlier comments, she hadn't forgotten them either. And as the day wore on, Carl would learn that true accountability comes not from fear, but from understanding. As the lunch break ended, people slowly trickled back into the courtroom, taking their seats with a mix of curiosity and anticipation. Word had spread quickly about the new judge, how she'd walked in wearing her robe, commanding respect without saying much. For many, it was surprising to see someone like Maya Johnson in such a position of authority. But for Carl, the bailiff, the shock hadn't worn off. If anything, it had deepened. Maya returned to the bench after the recess, her movements steady and deliberate. She carried herself with confidence, every step exuding purpose. As she settled into her chair and adjusted her robe, she glanced around the room, making brief eye contact with those present. It wasn't meant to intimidate. It was simply her way of acknowledging everyone equally. Still, Carl couldn't shake the feeling that her gaze lingered on him just a little longer than necessary. The first case after lunch involved a dispute between two neighbors over property lines. One neighbor claimed the other had built a fence too close to their shared boundary, while the other argued the original survey was incorrect. Both sides were passionate, speaking loudly and interrupting each other whenever possible. The tension in the room grew thicker with each passing minute. Maya listened carefully, her expression neutral but attentive. She didn't raise her voice or show frustration when the arguments became heated. Instead, she waited patiently for both parties to finish before asking clarifying questions. Her tone was firm but fair, cutting through the chaos without escalating it. "Let's focus on facts," she said at one point, her voice calm but authoritative. "Emotions won't help us resolve this." Carl watched from the sidelines, still, struggling to process what was happening. He'd always thought of judges as older, more traditional figures, people who fit neatly into his idea of authority. Seeing Maya in that role challenged everything he'd assumed. And worse, it forced him to confront his own biases. Every time she spoke, every decision she made, reminded him of how wrong he'd been earlier that day. When the hearing concluded, Maya delivered her ruling with clarity and precision. She explained her reasoning step by step, ensuring both parties understood why she'd reached her conclusion. Though neither side seemed entirely happy, they left the courtroom nodding reluctantly, acknowledging the fairness of her judgment. As the next case began, Carl found himself fumbling with his duties. Normally, he prided himself on being efficient, handing out forms, guiding witnesses to the stand, maintaining order. But now, his hands trembled slightly, and his mind kept drifting back to his earlier encounter with Maya. What if she decided to report him? Would he lose his job over something so stupid? These thoughts distracted him, causing him to misplace a document and stumble over his words when addressing the court. At one point, Maya noticed his clumsiness and paused mid-sentence. "Is everything all right, Mr. Bailiff?" she asked, her voice level but piercing. Carl froze, caught off guard by the direct question. Yes, Your Honor," he stammered, avoiding her gaze. "Just, fine. Everything's fine." Maya studied him for a moment before nodding and continuing with the proceedings. To anyone else, it might have seemed like a minor exchange. But for Carl, it felt like a spotlight had been trained directly on him, exposing all his flaws and insecurities. Later, during another short recess, Carl couldn't take it anymore. He approached Maya's chambers hesitantly, knocking softly on the door. When she called for him to enter, he stepped inside, closing the door behind him. The room was small but tidy, with shelves lined with legal books and framed certificates. On the walls, Maya sat behind her desk reviewing notes from the morning's cases. "Your Honor," Carl began, his voice shaky. I wanted to apologize for earlier, before the session started." Maya looked up from her papers, her expression unreadable. She gestured for him to sit, which only made him more nervous. "Go on," she said simply. "I didn't realize who you were," Carl continued, stumbling over his words. "I mean, I didn't know you were the judge. I shouldn't have spoken to you the way I did. It was disrespectful, and I'm sorry." For a long moment, Maya said nothing. She leaned back in her chair, studying him carefully. Finally, she spoke. "Do you know why apologies matter, Mr. Bailiff?" Carl blinked, caught off guard by the question. Because they show regret?" "Partly," Maya replied. "But, more importantly, they show accountability. Saying, 'I'm sorry' is easy. Changing your behavior is hard. Words are meaningless unless they're backed by action." Carl nodded slowly, absorbing her words. "I understand, Your Honor. I really do. I'll try to do better, I promise." Maya sighed softly, leaning forward again. "Let me tell you something," she said, her voice softer now. "When I was serving overseas, I worked under a commanding officer who doubted my abilities. He thought I couldn't handle the responsibilities of leadership because of who I am, a black woman. Every day I had to prove myself, not just to him, but to everyone else who shared his views." She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. "Those experiences shaped me. They taught me resilience, patience, and the importance of leading by example. But they also showed me that ignorance isn't always malicious. Sometimes it's just ignorance. People act out of fear or misunderstanding. That doesn't excuse bad behavior, but it does leave room for growth." Carl listened intently, his guilt mingling with gratitude for her willingness to share her story. "Thank you for telling me that," he said quietly. "I never meant to offend you. I was wrong, and I'll do whatever it takes to make sure it doesn't happen again." Maya nodded, accepting his apology cautiously. "Good. Start by treating everyone in this courthouse with the same respect you'd give any judge or lawyer, regardless of how they look, what they wear, or where they come from. Justice isn't blind because it chooses to ignore differences. It's blind because it treats everyone equally." With that, she dismissed him, returning to her work as if the conversation had never happened. Carl left the chambers feeling a mix of relief and determination. He knew he had a lot to learn, but for the first time in years he felt motivated to change. Back in the courtroom, the afternoon sessions resumed. This time, Carl paid closer attention to his actions, consciously working to be more respectful and professional. He greeted visitors warmly, offered assistance when needed, and avoided making assumptions about anyone. Though it was a small start, it marked the beginning of a transformation, one that would take time but was worth pursuing. Meanwhile, Maya continued to preside over the cases with the same calm efficiency she'd shown all day. Each ruling demonstrated not only her knowledge of the law but also her commitment to fairness and integrity. By the end of the session, even the most skeptical observers had to admit, Judge Maya Johnson was exactly the kind of leader their community needed. As the final gavel struck, signaling the end of the day's proceedings, Maya gathered her belongings and prepared to leave. Carl approached her one last time, this time with genuine respect in his eyes. "Have a good evening, Your Honor," he said, his tone sincere. "Thank you, Mr. Bailiff," Maya replied with a slight smile. "See you tomorrow." With that, she walked out of the courtroom, her head held high. Outside, the sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the courthouse steps. As she descended, a group of children on a school field trip stopped to watch her, their faces filled with awe and curiosity. One of them raised a hand timidly, asking, "Are you really a judge?" Maya knelt down to their level, smiling warmly. "Yes, I am, and maybe someday one of you will be too." Her words lingered in the air, planting seeds of hope and possibility in young minds. Though the day had been challenging, Maya felt a sense of fulfillment knowing she was making a difference, not just in the courtroom, but in the lives of those around her. After leaving the courthouse that evening, Carl drove home in silence, replaying the day's events over and over in his mind. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, knuckles white as he navigated the familiar roads leading to his neighborhood. Normally, the drive gave him time to unwind, but tonight there was no peace to be found. Every red light seemed like a stop sign reminding him of his mistakes. Every honk from another car felt like an accusation echoing Maya's words. Justice isn't blind because it chooses to ignore differences. It's blind because it treats everyone equally. When he finally pulled into the driveway, Carl sat in the car for a few minutes, staring at the house without moving. He dreaded telling Linda about what had happened. She'd always been supportive of him, but she also had little tolerance for arrogance or prejudice. If anyone could see through excuses, it was her. Taking a deep breath, Carl stepped out of the car and walked inside. The smell of dinner still lingered in the air, though the kitchen was clean and quiet. Linda was sitting in the living room, reading a book under the soft light of a table lamp. When she heard him enter, she looked up, smiling briefly before noticing the troubled look on his face. "What's wrong?" she asked, setting the book aside. Her tone was gentle but firm, the kind that demanded honesty. Carl hesitated, unsure where to begin. He sank onto the couch across from her, running a hand through his thinning hair. "I messed up today," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Big time." Linda raised an eyebrow, waiting for him to elaborate. "Okay, care to tell me more?" So Carl told her everything. The sarcastic comments he'd made to Maya, his rude assumptions about her, and the humiliating realization that she was the judge. As he spoke, his shame grew heavier, each word feeling like a weight pressing down on his chest. By the end of the story, he was slumped forward, unable to meet her gaze. For a moment, Linda didn't say anything. She just stared at him, her lips pressed into a thin line. Then, shaking her head slightly, she leaned back in her chair. "Carl," she said, her voice tinged with disappointment. "What were you thinking?" "You know better than that." "I wasn't thinking," Carl muttered, rubbing his temples. "That's the problem. I saw her sitting there looking so casual and I just jumped to conclusions. I thought she didn't belong here, that she was wasting everyone's time. But I was wrong, so wrong." Linda sighed, crossing her arms over her chest. "It's not just about being wrong, Carl. It's about why you assumed those things in the first place. Why did you think she didn't belong? Because of how she looked? How she dressed? That's not fair, and you know it." Carl nodded miserably. "You're right. I do know it. And that's what makes it worse. I've seen enough." People come through that courthouse to know appearances don't mean anything. But today I let my guard down. I acted like, like someone who thinks they're better than others. Linda finished for him, her tone sharp but not unkind. And maybe part of you does think that way, even if you don't want to admit it. The truth of her words hit Carl like a punch to the gut. He'd always prided himself on being a decent person, someone who worked hard and treated others fairly. But now, he couldn't deny that there was a darker side to him, a side shaped by years of ingrained biases and unchecked privilege. It was uncomfortable to confront, but he knew he couldn't keep ignoring it either. "I apologized to her," he said after a pause. "During the recess, I went to her chambers and told her I was sorry. She accepted it, but she also said something that stuck with me. She said apologies are meaningless unless they're backed by action." Linda nodded approvingly. "That's true. Saying sorry is easy. Changing your behavior takes effort. What are you going to do differently?" Carl hesitated, unsure how to answer. He wanted to promise her and himself that he'd change, but he didn't know where to start. "I guess I'll try harder," he said slowly. "I'll pay attention to how I treat people. Not just in the courthouse, but everywhere. I won't make assumptions based on looks or clothes or anything else. I'll remember that everyone deserves respect no matter who they are." Linda studied him for a moment, searching his face for sincerity. Finally, she softened, giving him a small smile. "That's a good start," she said. "But remember, actions speak louder than words. Show me and show yourself that you mean it." Later that night, as Carl lay in bed staring at the ceiling, his mind drifted back to Maya's story. He kept thinking about what she'd said about her commanding officer doubting her abilities, about proving herself every single day. It made him realize how much harder life must have been for her, and for countless others who faced similar challenges. While he'd coasted through life taking shortcuts and making snap judgments, people like Maya had been fighting uphill battles just to earn basic respect. He thought about his own upbringing too. Growing up in a small town like this one, he'd never really encountered diversity. Everyone looked the same, talked the same, believed the same things. It wasn't until he started working at the courthouse that he interacted with people from different backgrounds, and even then, he hadn't bothered to understand their perspectives. Instead, he'd clung to stereotypes and assumptions, using them as excuses to justify his behavior. But now, lying awake in the dark, Carl realized he couldn't keep living that way. If he wanted to be the kind of person his wife believed he could be, if he wanted to earn back some measure of self-respect, he needed to do better. He needed to listen, learn, and grow. The next morning, Carl woke up early, determined to take the first step toward change. Before heading to work, he spent some time online, researching articles and videos about unconscious bias and systemic racism. At first, the information overwhelmed him. There was so much he hadn't known, so much he'd overlooked. But instead of shutting it out, he forced himself to keep reading, to sit with the discomfort and let it sink in. By the time he arrived at the courthouse, he felt a mix of nerves and resolve. He knew changing his mindset wouldn't happen overnight, but he was ready to try. Throughout the day, he paid closer attention to how he interacted with people. When visitors came in, he greeted them warmly, asking if they needed help rather than assuming they were lost or wasting time. During hearings, he focused on performing his duties efficiently, avoiding distractions and maintaining professionalism. Maya noticed the shift immediately. Though Carl still seemed a bit uneasy around her, his behavior was markedly different from the previous day. He was polite, attentive, and genuinely trying to improve. After the session ended, she called him into her chambers again, not to reprimand him but to acknowledge his efforts. "I wanted to thank you," she said, surprising him, "for taking steps to change. It's not easy to confront your flaws, but it's important. Keep going." Carl nodded, gratitude washing over him. "Thank you, Your Honor. I will." As the days turned into weeks, Carl continued to work on himself. He attended workshops on cultural sensitivity, joined discussions about equity in the workplace, and made a conscious effort to challenge his own biases whenever they surfaced. It wasn't always comfortable. In fact, it was often incredibly humbling, but he stuck with it, knowing it was the right thing to do. Meanwhile, Maya carried on with her duties, earning admiration from colleagues and citizens alike. Her presence in the courtroom inspired respect, not just because of her authority, but because of the fairness and compassion she brought to every decision. People began to see her not just as a judge, but as a symbol of hope and progress. One evening, as Carl locked up the courthouse after a long day, he spotted Maya walking to her car. On impulse, he called out to her. "Your Honor," he said, jogging to catch up. "I just wanted to say thank you for everything." Maya smiled, tilting her head slightly. "Thank me for what?" "For believing in second chances," Carly replied earnestly. "And for showing me that change is possible." Maya nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Change starts with awareness, Mr. Bailiff. You've taken the first step. Now keep walking." With that, she got into her car and drove away, leaving Carl standing in the parking lot, a renewed sense of purpose lighting up his face. Weeks had passed since Carl's initial apology to Maya, and while he was far from perfect, his efforts to change were evident to everyone around him. He no longer dismissed visitors based on appearances or treated them with thinly veiled contempt. Instead, he greeted people warmly, offered assistance when needed, and did his best to maintain professionalism at all times. It wasn't always easy. Old habits die hard, but Carl was determined to prove that he meant what he said. That morning, however, Carl faced one of his toughest tests yet. A custody case had been scheduled for hearing, involving two parents locked in a bitter battle over their young daughter. Emotions ran high, and tensions threatened to boil over before the session even began. As Carl ushered the parties into the courtroom, he could feel the hostility radiating off them. One parent accused the other of lying, while the other countered with accusations of manipulation. The lawyers weren't much better, snapping at each other and interrupting constantly. Maya sat patiently behind the bench, observing everything with a calm demeanor. Her presence alone seemed to command respect, though it didn't stop the arguments from escalating. At one point, a lawyer handed Carl a document to pass along to the judge, instructing him to clarify which section pertained to the current discussion. Nervous and distracted by the chaos, Carl mispronounced a key detail, stumbling over the words awkwardly. "Your Honor," he began, clearing his throat. This part here refers to, the visitation schedule?" The lawyer immediately jumped in, visibly frustrated. "No, bailiff, that's not correct. That section addresses child support payments, not visitation." Carl's face flushed red as murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Some spectators exchanged knowing glances, while others whispered comments about how poorly the bailiff was handling things. Even Maya raised an eyebrow, her expression unreadable but clearly unimpressed. "I apologize, Your Honor," Carl stammered, fumbling to correct himself. "I misspoke. This section does indeed refer to child support payments." The lawyer rolled, their eyes muttering under their breath while the opposing counsel seized the opportunity to criticize Carl further. "Perhaps we should ensure that our court staff is properly briefed before stepping into such sensitive matters," they remarked sharply, earning nods of agreement from some in the audience. For Carl, the moment felt like a punch to the gut. All his progress over the past few weeks seemed to vanish in an instant. He stood frozen, unsure how to recover, his confidence crumbling under the weight of public scrutiny. His mind raced with thoughts of failure and embarrassment. Would Maya think he hadn't changed at all? Would she lose faith in him? But then something unexpected happened. Without raising her voice or showing frustration, Maya intervened firmly, redirecting everyone's focus back to the case. "Let's stay on track," she said, her tone steady and authoritative. "This isn't about personal mistakes. It's about resolving the matter at hand. Mr. Bailiff, please take a moment to review the document thoroughly before proceeding." Her words carried weight, silencing the murmurs and refocusing attention on the hearing. For Carl, they were more than just instructions. They were a lifeline. Maya hadn't publicly humiliated him or joined in the criticism. Instead, she'd given him a chance to regroup and redeem himself. Grateful for the opportunity, Carl stepped aside, taking a deep breath to steady his nerves. He carefully reviewed the document, ensuring he understood every detail before continuing. When he returned to the bench, his voice was clearer, his movements more deliberate. Though the mistake couldn't be erased, he managed to handle the rest of the proceedings smoothly, earning a subtle nod of approval from Maya. Later, during a recess, Carl approached Maya's chambers once again, this time with a mix of gratitude and humility. "Your Honor," he said, knocking softly on the door. "May I speak with you for a moment?" "Of course," Maya replied, gesturing for him to sit. She set aside the papers she'd been reviewing and gave him her full attention. "What's on your mind?" Carl hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "I wanted to thank you for, earlier, I messed up and I know I let everyone down. But instead of making it worse, you helped me fix it. I won't forget that." Maya studied him for a moment, her expression thoughtful. "Everyone makes mistakes, Mr. Bailiff. What matters is how we respond to them. You could have shut down after that incident, but you chose to push through and do better. That shows growth." Her words meant more to Carl than she realized. They reinforced the lessons he'd been learning over the past few weeks. That accountability isn't about perfection, but about resilience. Mistakes are inevitable, but they become opportunities for improvement when handled with honesty and effort. "I'm still learning," Carl admitted, his voice tinged with vulnerability. "Some days are harder than others, but I'm trying. Every day I remind myself of what you said. Actions matter more than words, and I want my actions to show that I've changed." Maya nodded approvingly. "Change takes time, Mr. Bailiff. Don't rush it. Just keep moving forward, one step at a time." Back in the courtroom, the afternoon sessions resumed, and Carl threw himself into his duties with renewed determination. He double-checked documents before handing them out, clarified instructions with lawyers beforehand, and maintained a composed demeanor even when tempers flared. By the end of the day, he felt a sense of accomplishment, not because he'd avoided mistakes entirely, but because he'd handled challenges with grace and perseverance. As the final gavel struck, signaling the conclusion of the day's proceedings, Maya gathered her belongings and prepared to leave. Carl approached her one last time, this time with genuine pride in his eyes. "Have a good evening, Your Honor," he said, his tone respectful and sincere. "Thank you, Mr. Bailiff," Maya replied with a slight smile. "See you tomorrow." With that, she walked out of the courtroom, her head held high. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. As she descended the courthouse steps, a group of students on a field trip stopped to watch her, their faces filled with curiosity and admiration. One of them raised a tentative hand, asking, "Are you really a judge?" Maya knelt down to their level, smiling warmly. "Yes, I am, and maybe someday one of you will be too." Her words lingered in the air, planting seeds of inspiration in young minds. For Carl, standing nearby, the moment served as a reminder of why his efforts mattered. Change wasn't just about improving himself, it was about creating a better environment for everyone. Watching Maya interact with the children, he realized that her presence in the courtroom represented hope, fairness, and the possibility of a brighter future. That night, as Carl drove home, he reflected on the day's events. Despite the challenges he'd faced, he felt a sense of fulfillment knowing he was becoming the kind of person others could trust. He thought about Maya's journey, the obstacles she'd overcome and the strength she'd shown, and drew motivation from her example. If she could rise above prejudice and doubt, so could he. When he arrived home, Linda greeted him with a warm smile. "How was your day?" she asked, noticing the lighter tone in his voice. "It was good," Carl replied, sitting down at the kitchen table. "Not perfect, but good. I learned a lot, and I think I'm getting closer to where I need to be." Linda nodded, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. "That's all anyone can ask for, Carl. Progress, not perfection." As they shared a quiet dinner together, Carl felt a renewed sense of purpose. He knew there would be more challenges ahead, more moments of doubt and discomfort. But he also knew he had the tools to face them, with patience, humility, and a commitment to doing better. In the weeks that followed, Carl continued to grow, both personally and professionally. He attended workshops, read books, and engaged in conversations about equity and justice, expanding his understanding of the world beyond his small-town bubble. Each step brought him closer to the person he wanted to be, a person worthy of the trust others placed in him. Meanwhile, Maya remained a steadfast figure in the courtroom, earning admiration for her fairness, wisdom, and compassion. Her presence inspired not only Carl but also countless others who crossed her path. Together they proved that change is possible, even in the most unlikely places. Weeks turned into months and the small-town courthouse became a place of transformation, not just for Carl, but for everyone who walked through its doors. The changes were subtle at first, almost imperceptible, but over time, they grew into something undeniable. People noticed how Carl greeted visitors with genuine kindness, how he went out of his way to assist those unfamiliar with court procedures, and how he treated everyone equally, regardless of appearance or background. His behavior set a new tone in the courtroom, one of respect and professionalism that rippled outward, influencing others around him. Maya, too, continued to make an impact far beyond her rulings. Her presence inspired confidence not only in the cases she presided over, but also in the community she served. Each decision she made was thoughtful and fair, reflecting her deep commitment to justice. Beyond the bench, she took opportunities to mentor young lawyers, encourage aspiring judges, and engage with local schools during outreach programs. For many, she represented more than authority. She symbolized resilience, fairness, and hope. One crisp autumn afternoon, as golden leaves swirled in the breeze outside, Maya stepped out of the courthouse after a long day. A group of elementary school students stood on the steps, their teacher explaining the importance of the legal system. When they spotted Maya in her judicial robe, their eyes lit up with curiosity. One brave child raised a hand and asked, "Are you really a judge?" Maya smiled warmly and knelt down to their level. "Yes, I am," she said, her voice gentle but clear. "And what do you want to be when you grow up?" The question sparked excitement among the children. Some shouted answers like doctor or teacher, while others hesitated, unsure. One little girl whispered shyly, "I want to help people." "Well," Maya replied, leaning closer conspiratorially, "that's what being a judge is all about, helping people find fairness and truth. Maybe someday you'll stand where I am now." The kids stared at her in awe, their imaginations ignited by the possibilities. As they thanked her and moved on, Maya felt a quiet sense of fulfillment. These moments reminded her why she'd worked so hard to reach this point, to create a better future, one person at a time. Inside the courthouse, Carl watched the exchange from a distance, feeling a swell of pride. He'd come a long way since that fateful day when he'd humiliated himself. And Maya. Back then, he'd been defensive and embarrassed, unable to see past his own biases. Now he understood the power of accountability and growth. Every challenge he faced had taught him something valuable, pushing him to become a better version of himself. That evening, as he tidied up the courtroom before heading home, Carl reflected on everything that had changed. He thought about Maya's patience with him, her willingness to give him a second chance. He remembered Linda's encouragement, her belief that he could rise above his flaws. And most importantly, he recalled the countless interactions he'd had with people coming to the courthouse, people whose lives he'd touched simply by treating them with dignity and respect. Carl knew he wasn't perfect. There were still moments when old habits crept in, when assumptions threatened to cloud his judgment. But each time he caught himself reminding himself of the lessons he'd learned. Change wasn't a destination, it was a journey, and every step forward mattered. As winter approached, the town prepared for its annual holiday celebration. The courthouse hosted a special event, inviting families to learn about the legal process in a fun, interactive way. Judges, lawyers, and staff volunteered their time to answer questions and guide activities. Maya led a mock trial for children, helping them understand how evidence and arguments shaped decisions. Carl assisted by organizing materials and ensuring everything ran smoothly. During the event, Carl found himself standing beside Maya as parents thanked her for making the law accessible to their kids. "You're amazing at this," he said quietly, his tone sincere. "You make it seem so easy." Maya chuckled softly. "It's not easy, Carl, but it's worth it. Seeing these kids dream big, knowing they might carry that dream forward, that makes every challenge worthwhile." Her words stayed with Carl long after the event ended. They reminded him of his own journey, the struggles, the missteps, and ultimately, the progress. He realized that true change wasn't just about fixing mistakes. It was about building connections, fostering understanding, and creating spaces where everyone felt valued. By spring, the courthouse had transformed into a model of inclusivity and respect. Visitors praised the staff for their professionalism, and lawyers commended the efficiency of proceedings. Even the skeptical townsfolk, who had once doubted whether someone like Maya belonged in such a role, now spoke highly of her leadership. She had earned their trust not through grand gestures but through consistent fairness and compassion. For Carl, the transformation was personal as well as professional. He no longer saw his job as merely maintaining order. He viewed it as an opportunity to serve others. Whether guiding a nervous witness to the stand or offering reassurance to a confused visitor, he approached each task with care and dedication. His colleagues noticed the shift, often commenting on how much he'd grown over the past year. One sunny morning, as Carl arrived at work, he spotted Maya walking toward the courthouse. She waved at him, her smile bright against the blue sky. "Good morning, Mr. Bailiff," she called out, her tone friendly yet formal. "Morning, Your Honor," Carl replied, returning the wave. "Ready for another day?" "As always," Maya said, pausing briefly. "And Carl, thank you for everything. You've come a long way." The compliment caught him off guard, but he accepted it graciously. "Thank you, Your Honor, for believing in me. I couldn't have done it without your guidance." Maya nodded, then continued inside, leaving Carl to reflect on her words. He knew the journey wasn't over. There would always be room for improvement. But he also knew he was on the right path. Together, he and Maya had created something meaningful, a courtroom where justice wasn't just a concept but a lived reality. Months later, as Maya sat alone in her chambers, she allowed herself a rare moment of reflection. The road to becoming a judge hadn't been easy. She'd faced discrimination, self-doubt, and countless obstacles along the way. Yet here she was, breaking barriers and paving the way for others to follow. Outside her window, the courthouse bustled with activity, a testament to the community's shared commitment to fairness and equality. She thought about Carl, too, how he'd stumbled at first only to rise stronger and more determined. His story reminded her that change was possible, even in the unlikeliest places. Everyone carried biases and blind spots, but recognizing them was the first step toward growth. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the room in soft shadows, Maya packed up her belongings and prepared to leave. Stepping outside, she took a deep breath, savoring the cool evening air. The courthouse steps were empty now, save for a few lingering visitors. Somewhere nearby, children laughed and played, their voices echoing through the quiet streets. Maya smiled to herself, feeling a profound sense of gratitude. Though challenges remained, she believed in the power of perseverance. Justice wasn't blind, it was alive, evolving, and shaped by the efforts of those who dared to seek it. And as long as people like Carl and Maya kept striving for a better world, the future held endless possibilities. With that thought, she walked toward her car, ready to face whatever came next.